I'm Jared Bowen. We're here with Adam Kinzinger, former congressman and one of two Republicans to serve on the House Select Committee investigating the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. He's also the author of the new memoir, Renegade. Adam Kinzinger, thanks so much for being with us.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So there was a big election night in America last night.
Yeah.
We saw the GOP still keep its strength in Mississippi, but not in Ohio, where abortion rights were voted into their culture there. We see the Democratic governor again in Kentucky and in Virginia, Democratic legislature. How are you reading what's happening in America right now as we look to 2024?
Well, last night was a good night for democracy. It was a bad night for the MAGA movement. Mississippi. So Tate Reeves hasn't been too bad on the MAGA stuff. I mean, he has, but he hasn't been out there, out front. It was a fairly close race. This is Mississippi we're talking about. Everywhere else, it was a Democratic night. I had a lot of people that were telling me that, the Democratic governor of Kentucky wouldn't win again. That was a fluke. He won pretty handily. Virginia was the big one. Glenn Youngkin comes in thinking this is going to launch his magic white horse candidacy against Donald Trump. Some people were going to, ride him in to run, and that killed him last night. He invested a lot in the issue of abortion and in his personal brand, and it failed in Virginia.
I tend to not have a lot of stock in polls personally,
right,
because they so often don't bear out. But we paid so much attention to polls earlier this week and how bad they are for the Biden administration going forward. How do you reconcile what happened last night with what the polls are telling us?
So last night, even though, for instance, Virginia went Democratic, if you actually aggregate all the numbers, it wasn't that big of a blowout, right? There were wins in certain areas which led to control of the House and the Senate. So I think that's important to notice. The other thing is state-by-state polls. In 2016, people say, well, the polls were all wrong. They were nationally. The state-by-state polls were fairly accurate. So if I'm advising the Democrats, I would say, look, take these numbers seriously. Now, we still have a year to go. All the standard, not the same people are talking to the polls. But be concerned, because I do think Donald Trump has strength. Anything over the next year can change that. I certainly hope it does. But we can't go into this thinking that this is going to be an automatic Biden victory.
What is the strength, fundamentally, what is the strength that Donald Trump has?
Donald Trump makes people feel heard, which is, to me, the most bizarre aspect of that is he is the most out-of-touch person, I think, that's ever been in politics. I mean, he lives in a golden tower, with golden toilets. But he says what a lot of folks in the Midwest particularly have felt, which is ignored by the coasts. And I represented a district like this. I saw it go from being a swing district to a very Republican district, not because of any inspiration, but out of anger. And I think Donald Trump taps into anger. Look, fear is really powerful in compelling people. Most good leaders in the past have known when to use fear and when to tamp it down for the sake of the country. Donald Trump, he doesn't have that governor on him. He just uses fear all the time. It's effective and dangerous.
Well, speaking of issues, it seems there's a lot of conversation right now, especially after last night, around abortion rights.
Right.
And is that going to trump fear, the fear narrative that was employed during the last election cycle? What's the place of abortion in this next election? And you're somebody who's pro-life, so how are you looking at this?
I think it's going to be an important factor this year. And, as a pro-lifer myself, and I'm fairly moderate on the issue of abortion, I always remind people there's not two sides to abortion. There's actually 100 different positions. What the Republicans should have done, which of course is just against the culture of them right now, is to come out with kind of life-type measures after Roe v. Wade was overturned. Talk about things like adoption, talk about things like family planning. Instead, they just went more and more extreme. And I think that rightly kind of frightened people in terms of, okay, well, they say it was for states' rights, and now some people are pushing 6-week abortion bans. So I think it's a loser for the Republicans. Typically, it was always easy for Republicans to use when Roe versus Wade was the law of the land. Whoever's usually on the out has the political power, and it's something that Republicans will have to reckon with, I think.
Yeah, is it going to take them down next year?
I don't know if it's going to take them down, because I'm just not sure abortion is that defining issue, but I think it's part of what will be going against Republicans next year, particularly the things like defense of democracy.
So I asked a moment ago about Donald Trump as a leader and what makes him so compelling. You were in the House, obviously. What makes him so compelling that your colleagues in the House have this steadfast allegiance to him?
You know what? I ask myself that question every day. And all I can say is it comes down to a few things. Fear of losing your election, losing your job. Early on in Donald Trump, people would speak out. They all got crushed. And so now it's like, well, why would I speak out? Because I have to exist. And it's a fear of like losing your identity. When you're elected to the House, I'll just take the House as the example. Any room you walk into, unless you're with a senator, governor, or president, you're the most powerful person in that room. That is addictive. And there is an ego point to that. So for somebody to knowingly give that up to make a statement is much harder, evidently, than it should be. But I remind people, you take an oath to the Constitution, not to getting reelected. And you got to be able to look at yourself in the mirror. But I think it really is driven by fear. And then after a number of years of compromising certain things, you can convince yourself that you have to do this because if you don't, somebody worse can come along.
How many of your colleagues are essentially two-faced? We're two-faced. One person publicly, but saying things very differently to you privately, especially as you were the person out front calling out truths and calling out the president.
All of them. I mean,
all of
maybe a couple of exceptions. You know, Matt Gaetz is an example. He doesn't believe any of this stuff, but he would never tell me that he doesn't believe it because I would actually dime him out. Everybody else, you know, you respect personal conversations, but people would come up to me all the time and say, you know, gosh, I appreciate what you're doing. Thank you for what you're doing, Adam. I can't do it because of my district. You know, like, what about my district? They're not pretty happy with me right now, and I could lose and will lose eventually if I had to run again. And that's what's sad. I don't know if I fear more somebody that doesn't know the truth or somebody that knows the truth and doesn't say it. I think that makes me more frightened because it shows how easily people can go along with lies.
Well, then where does the course correction that so many people seem to want and that you've been talking about and also in your book, where does that course correction come if that fear is now ingrained?
Well, I don't have the full answer because if I did, I'd be certainly implementing all of it. I think the course correction, though, will come with Republicans continuing to lose because naturally that is like an antiseptic to whatever course you're on in politics because people want to win. I think it's as the next generation comes into power, I don't think they're as diluted. But it's really going to take people standing up and speaking out. And it took us, I think the thing to keep in mind, it took decades to get to this point. And I talk about it in my book, the time that I saw in the rot. It's going to take some time to get out. But what I tell people is just release that pressure to be the only person that can make a difference. Continue to make a difference. Stay engaged. And I think the course correction is going to come overnight someday. I don't know if that's going to be in the next year or in 5 years. But just like Barack Obama came along and sparked something, Ronald Reagan came along and sparked something, something will spark. I just don't know when.
Where do the Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, George Santos, where do they fit into this whole equation?
They're just con artists. I mean, just frankly, they got into politics for one reason, to be famous. You know, fame is a drug. Because somebody that has experienced fame, it can be a drug, and you have to treat it very gingerly before you become addicted. And I went through addiction cycles with it. You know, I talk about that. Well, now in politics, if you say something outlandish or crazy, instead of being shamed, you become famous. And so the people that have this drive for fame at all costs that can't make it in Hollywood have all decided to turn to politics. And that's where I think people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz are.
And this is, I'm a little bit concerned about what you just said about the younger generation. I don't mean to cast an aspersion against the entire younger generation, but they're also growing up in this social media world where they know that they can gain fame with posts and broadcast it, and that it's that mentality that's being passed down. And to what extent does that concern you about the rising politicians?
It does concern me, but I think like that fame thing is unfortunately not just the younger generations. You see that now everywhere. I was just watching an ad for a social media site which had old ladies in nursing homes that were using this to become famous. And so it's something that's infected all of the country, really all of humanity. And it's also interesting because for the first time in the world, we have something in our cell phones that can outperform the human brain, which has never happened in history. But just like any new technology, it's abused at first, and then people learn how to regulate themselves. When soda was introduced, or pop as we call it in the Midwest, people would drink a case a day. Now you rarely see that. I hope that happens with this too.
What was the crux? You talked about your own fame addiction. What was the crux of your sober movement?
So it was when that fame addiction came into contact with my moral compass. And I'd always said to myself that I never want to get out of this job with any kind of embarrassment or inability to look at myself in the mirror, because God has given me this like moment in politics to do something, you know, and even if I never become known for it, when you represent 700,000 people, like, wow, that's big. And that came into conflict with what I believed. When the way to stay in and to stay in the fame game and to stay on, you know, certain news channels was to justify a man that I think was the worst man to ever occupy the Oval Office. That's when that came to conflict, and it's something I couldn't follow through on.
Was it also about money, not having the followers? What were you giving up to finally start speaking out?
I don't know. I mean, if I would have kind of gone on the crazy train, maybe I'd have more money and more followers. I'm not sure. The thing you give up is, you know, when I was facing that crossroads, if I'd have gone a different way, I would have known what that road was. I would have known I would have been generally safe on that road politically. I would have been safe in terms of money and everything else. When you go the narrow road, the unknown road, that's a little frightening. It doesn't mean like I'm happy now, I'm taken care of and everything, but there is some unknown on that way. If you go with the like guaranteed fame route, you know what you get. And that's why so many people just go down the wide road.
A couple questions about the January 6th committee. What is the most important takeaway that you want people to know, either that was widely reported or that you fundamentally thought this is the heart of this report and people need to understand this?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things on it, but the biggest thing I want people to see, it's a kind of a sobering thing, is that January 6th was a symptom. You know, everybody, once the Capitol was sacked, it kind of became a focus of just January 6th. We even call it the January 6th Select Committee. The reality is the bad stuff was everything that happened prior. It happened with the Department of Justice, thankfully resisting Donald Trump's demand that they say the election was corrupt so that he could take that doubt and exploit it. You know, all those dangerous things that happened, that was the rot. And the problem is, and again, the sobering thing is, that's not been fixed. You know, and it may never get fixed because it's, again, democracy is just as strong as the people that hold up to their oaths. But that's why when we vote, we have to take people that take their oaths seriously. We can make differences, we can be aware, but we came pretty close on January 6th, and that situation still exists.
You've mentioned the word rot twice. What is the rot?
I think the rot is, we assumed that people took their oaths seriously, that they would stay within the guardrails of democracy, and that institutions were kind of this unique thing that could hold independently. The Supreme Court says something, we do it. You know, the federal government says something, we do it. The rot is the recognition that those guardrails are only as strong as we want them to be. For instance, if the Supreme Court comes out with a judgment and we just decide we don't want to deal with it, right? There's no police force for the Supreme Court. That's rot when you start to think of the ways and see the ways where you can violate the compact that we've all agreed to. You only need a basic thing to exist for democracy to work, and that's just simply that you can vote, your vote counts, the voter wins, or the person wins. When that starts to get destroyed, I don't know how you ever create a healthy environment again.
Where does hate, resentment, racism come into all of that?
All over. It's all over it. And you can see in the dog whistles, for instance, of Donald Trump. And you can see, frankly, in some of what I would call the pro-Hamas stuff you're seeing right now on the far, far left. It's not as big as what you'd see on the right. But all of this resentment and hate and inability to discuss with each other and empathize with each other is a big problem. And I would see, you know, racism, for instance, was never, that I noticed, very overt in my party, but it was always kind of under the surface. You know, immigration, I've sometimes jokingly but seriously said, if there was a lot of immigration from Ireland, I'm not sure people would be as upset about it. We do need to do something about immigration, but some people are driven to that by the racial side of it. So all of that comes into play. And it's not a government thing that you can fix. You can't dictate how people think. But that's a failure of colleges. It's a failure of school. It's a failure of upbringing.
Speaking of your party, are you still a Republican?
You know, I consider myself one because I refuse to leave and I refuse to give up that fight because this country needs two healthy parties. I voted Democratic last cycle, though, and I would assume I'm going to vote Democratic this coming cycle.
Is Donald Trump going to be the next president?
Look, I think there's a greater than 50% chance he's certainly going to be the nominee. And unfortunately, that comes with about a 50% chance he's the next president. Look, I think if I had to be Donald Trump or Joe Biden, I would probably prefer to be Joe Biden. But anything can happen in the next year. And that's why I say what we need is an uncomfortable alliance between the reasonable right, the center, and the left to defend democracy. We can debate issues all day long. Let's do it when we save democracy.
Who would be the two best candidates in that matchup then, putting aside Joe Biden and Donald Trump?
Look, I'm a Chris Christie fan because he's telling the truth out there. Nikki Haley to an extent. So there's some good Republicans, but anybody that's defended Donald Trump is off my list now. So let's take somebody like, I don't know, Charlie Baker as an example, like that. That would be good. On the Democratic side, I haven't been paying close enough attention to see who would be good. I guess Pete Buttigieg, I think he's a legitimate person with a heart for the country. We'll see what the bench is. That's the great thing, though, is 2028, all new candidates from both sides. I think there's an opportunity for a lot of new energy and ideas to come in.
Do you plan on running in 2028?
It's not the plan, but I'd never say no because I'm very cautious. I don't want people to think what I'm saying is so that I can set myself up in some grand scheme to run. I'd be happy to never enter public service again. But I also have the itch still. And I know that I'm passionate about this country. And when I talk about the things I believe in, I'm like, gosh, I just want everybody to hear it. So I wouldn't say no, but it's certainly not something I'm planning at the moment.
Well, how do you see people responding to you? I just saw it last night at the Boston Speaker Series at Symphony Hall. You had thousands of people who were roaring even before you started speaking, just because of what you represented and what you've talked about in upholding democratic values. So when you see that, and what potential do you feel you have in running for office again as president?
Yeah, look, it's certainly, the reaction I've gotten has been incredible. And the number of people that come up and thank me, and I'm not saying this in any way bragging, I think it just goes to show that people are hungry for somebody that's going to defend the truth out there. I have liberal Democrats tell me they appreciate Liz Cheney. 3 years ago, I would never have imagined anything like that would be uttered from anybody. But it shows me that there's an undercurrent of something that has yet to be tapped into. And I don't know if that's Adam running as a Democrat or a Republican or an independent or not running at all, or if it's somebody else that can come along and do it. But I will tell you, just like Donald Trump in 2016 accidentally tapped into people wanting to break the system, the country's ready to be healed. They just may not feel it yet, and we're not going to know it until that undercurrent has exploded.
I know you're trying to leave on a note of optimism, but let me go back to the January 6th committee for just a moment. You did your work. You only had so much access. Now Justice is doing their work, the Justice Department. They have people like Mark Meadows. They have Donald Trump's attorneys now turning and cooperating. What do you expect that they're going to get that you couldn't get?
Well, they're going to be able to pick up where we left off. We were time limited. We knew that there was an end date to this committee. We also knew the people that we were asking for information were going to try to stall to that end date, and many of them did. We still were able to get a compelling case. Justice is now able to literally take that baton and run with it, and they have much more compelling ways to force people to cooperate. They can use immunity. We chose not to use immunity. And so I think they're going to get a lot more answers. What I'm interested in is things like the Secret Service. I want to know what Mark Meadows knew when he stopped cooperating with us, because frankly, his early tranche of text that he shared with us is the reason we got as far as we did. And he held back a lot that Justice now has. So I think it's going to be a compelling case, because I think our case on the committee was quite compelling. And now what Justice is going to have is going to be even further.
What do you suspect was in the rest of those texts? Where were the Mark Meadows texts leading you?
It was showing us connections that existed and just the open discussion people were having about what this court case could do, or, let's use the Constitution to say this, and who he was texting with. The wife of a Supreme Court justice, for God's sakes. So probably a lot more rich detail on that, and particularly what would be interesting is what he was texting after January 6th. I'm not sure we got many of those texts. Including potential obstruction of justice charges.
So will there be a convictions of Donald Trump?
I believe so. Now the question is, does this happen before the presidential election? I think there's a good chance now that one of those cases will go through, probably the January 6th one, and maybe even Georgia. The danger is if Donald Trump wins, and then he either pardons himself if he's convicted, or he can direct now DOJ to drop the cases, and they'll be forced to.
All right, I'll let you end on a positive note. For the people who are watching this saying, we've never been here before, this is too far gone, how can we possibly get it back? How can they get it back?
Well, look, I just look back 70 years ago, 150 years ago, all these times in American history. One led to a civil war. Let's hope that doesn't happen. But all these times were in moments where we feel like there's no way we can leave the country better off, and we do it every time. I don't think our generation will be the first one to fail to do that. I think the American spirit is still strong. The fact that people feel unwell about where the democracy is right now is a really good sign. I don't know what the answer is, but I know that somewhere out there in this collective kind of conscious of the American people, there is an answer, and that answer will be implemented. And we can look back and say, man, 2023, I hope we can say it was the end of the rough times. And boy, we really came back after that.
All right, Adam Kinzinger, thank you so much.
Yeah, anytime. Thank you.